In the last weeks and months, we've seen sexual scandals plaguing the Catholic Church, beginning with allegations against once Cardinal McCarrick, all the way through the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and now we're hearing things from all over the world, and the Pope is calling all the heads of conferences of Catholic bishops to discuss this plague in our church. And all over the internet, all over social media, Catholics are asking, what can we do? And to be honest, when it comes to procedures, there's not much we can do. However, there has been a call recently in the last week or so for a return to the Catholic Ember Days. The Bishop of Pittsburgh recommended all of his clergy, all of his priests, to celebrate the penitential season of the Ember Weeks, going all the way back, according to tradition, to the 200s, and looking at what they are, how you do them. And then I want to challenge you at the end to take up the Ember Days. You're not bound by conscience. They're no longer on the books in the Catholic Church. But they are a time-honored practice of penitential prayer, notably for vocations to the Catholic priesthood and for holy priests. And we'll see how these Ember Days relate to vocations and our own vocations crisis. So let's look at the Ember Days. So the Ember Days in Latin are called the Quatuor Tempora. Quatuor meaning four, and tempora is plural for tempus. Tempora means times. So the Ember Days are the 4 times of the year, that is the 4 seasons, which correspond to Lent, June, September, and December. And they're 3 days of fasting on a Wednesday, on a Friday, and on a Saturday. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish referred to these 4 times, the 4 temporas, as temporas. And you might be familiar with the Japanese style of frying shrimp or vegetables, tempura batter. That actually isn't a Japanese word. It's actually a Spanish and Portuguese word. And it goes back to the Catholic missionaries in Japan who requested a special meatless meal on the tempuras. And so there is the tempura style of Japanese food. The Germans and the English referred to the Quatuor Tempora, the 4 times, as the Quatembers. And you can see there on the screen the Latin word tempora is corrupted by the Germans and the English into ember. You take off the T and you get empora or empor. So they referred to the 4 embers. And we see that in our own language with regard to the calendar. So September is the 7th tempora, the 7th time. October is the 8th time, the 8th month. Now, the 4 times goes back into creation itself with the 4 seasons, but it also goes into Roman history as a recognition of the 4 harvest seasons. These were times of fasting, asking that there might be a full harvest. And in the Roman Church, this idea of fasting for a harvest was associated with the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray that the Lord would send laborers into the harvest." And the harvest, of course, is souls. And so going back to Pope Calixtus, who died in 222, he regulated that all Christians in Rome should celebrate these fasts 4 times a year, Quatuor Tempora, to pray for vocations to the priesthood, holy priests, holy laborers in the harvest, in the vineyard of Jesus Christ. Later on, Pope Leo the Great, who died in 461, he actually believed that the Quatuor Tempora, the Ember Days, were apostolic institutions, that these go all the way back to the 12. I don't think that's right, A, because history doesn't testify to it, and then B, we see none of the Eastern churches celebrating the Ember Days. And if it had been the case that John and James and all the other apostles besides Peter and Paul were also celebrating the Ember Days, we'd see them everywhere. But we really only see them in the Roman jurisdiction. Pope Gelasius, who died in 496, he says that all ordinations to all 7 orders should be celebrated in conjunction with the Ember Days. And so since that time period, all the way up until Vatican II, the Ember Days were the times of ordination. We see in the book of Acts that the apostles fast and pray, and then they lay hands on the candidate. It's very important to keep that apostolic order. And so maybe Leo the Great was thinking of that. He sees the apostles in Acts fasting, praying, and then ordaining. So the idea is that ordination happens in the context of fasting. That's something we've gotten away from, and I think it's a problem. We need to get back to that. Now, the Ember Days spread throughout the church in the Roman West. We see in the 600s that the Ember Days are being celebrated in England. In the 700s, all through Gaul, which is modern-day France. Charlemagne is aware of the Ember Days. And from there, it's basically all throughout Roman Christianity until Vatican II. Now, when are the Ember Days? When are these Ember Weeks? Well, if we start the liturgical year in Advent, the first one is between the third and fourth Sundays of Advent. This is around the Feast of St. Lucy. The next one is at the beginning of Lent. The next one is between Pentecost and Trinity Sunday. And then the final one, which is always in September, is usually the third week of September, which is about after the Feast of the Holy Cross. As I said before, all Catholics kept this fast. It was 3 days, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, of fasting from all meat and only one meal a day with 2 collations, or one meal with 2 snacks. So just as we celebrate Good Friday, these 3 days, 4 times a year, would be celebrated as the Ember Days. All of this stopped in 1966. Pope Paul VI decreed that all Ember Days should be removed from the calendar and that the clergy and the laity no longer had to observe these days of fast and abstinence. But if you look around since 1966, that springtime of evangelization that John Paul II spoke so eloquently about has not happened. We've seen drops in almost all the sacraments in the West. We've seen drops in vocations. We've also seen a spread of heresy and confusion. And now, with these recent allegations and revelations, we're seeing moral corruption all the way into the walls of Vatican City itself. So the challenge that's out there is, what can we do as lay people, even priests watching this? What can we do? Before I was a Catholic, I was an Anglican clergyman. I was an Anglican priest. And surprisingly, we still had the Ember Days on our calendar. So as an Anglican cleric, I observed and saw the Ember Days on our liturgical ordo. When I became a Catholic, poof, they were gone. I no longer had the Ember Days. So for me, I like the idea of the Ember Days. It's a traditional practice. It's time-honored, goes back to the 200s, and it was a process that brought in fasting in connection with vocations, in connection with prayer. And so I'm challenging myself, and I want to challenge you as well, to take up the Ember Days. Again, you're not obliged. It's not in the books. No one's forcing you. This is total free will. It's volitional. And again, you're not in sin if you break it, if you decide to do it and you don't. But it is a time-honored practice, and we need to pray for our priests, the ones we have, and we need to pray for future priests, that we get Orthodox men who are holy, who love our Lord, love the sacraments, love Our Lady, and love this great faith that's been deposited in the bosom of Holy Mother Church. So please consider joining me to celebrate the Ember Days. Tell other people about it. Spread this video around. Let people know about what the Ember Days are. And if you like this video, please like it. Please subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you in more Catholic videos to come. God bless. God bless. It's that you have killed your soul. Your soul had grace in it, had sanctifying grace in it, and now you've emptied it. You've stoned yourself. You've committed spiritual suicide.
Which bore implications on the side of what sorts of crimes and vices needed to be punished by the state, right? When Christ makes this typological transformation, the kinds of sin that end up still being valid for death penalty by positive law, right, transform to a more recognizable form of proportionalism, right? Like nowadays, we wouldn't say that because this is what the atheists essentially who love to pick on the Old Testament love to say.
Like, oh, do you eat shrimp? Yeah. Do you eat pig? Yeah. They gotcha. The gotcha. They don't understand.
Right.
That we actually thought about that for a few hundred years.
Sure. But I mean, it's an important thing, because it's like nowadays we'd say, even by the time you get to Saint like Thomas's time or Robert Bellarmine, they're saying basically they're enumerating for murder, but I think one of the two of them says for rape as well. it's valid.
And then
it's
also,
like, okay,
and then Thomas will get to that, says for heresy, not just holding heresy, but propagating heresy.
that's right. Yeah, propagating it publicly.
Yes,
which
because he says that that's worse than killing the body or killing the soul.
That's right.
So
that's right.
So we also find when Christ is before Pilate, he says to him, "You would not have this authority to kill me, right? Unless it had been given to you from above." And this is, I mean, this is a really important one, Tim. Christ himself is basically saying Pilate, as a Roman governor, has the power of the sword, as indicated in Genesis 9:6.
Right. Well, I think it's huge. I mean, so what people have to understand when you get into these debates, it's playing, 5-card poker. You're not playing the cards, you're playing the man that you're in the debate with. So it's like, if you're in a debate it's a distinction of degree, it's a sliding continuum. With a liberal enough Catholic, they'll be like, yeah, I don't give a damn what the church teaches, what scripture or tradition says. If the more liberal they are, the more they'll own that.
They'll say Leviticus, I'm not convinced at all by Leviticus.
But I mean, I'm talking Hayekian, someone that studied, or not Hayek, Harnack, Harnack type, even liberal Protestant or liberal enough Catholic, they'll even say, well, Jesus' suggestions were good, but basically he was sent to teach us nice manners. So everything is not divinely inspired. We don't need to see it that way. That's at one extreme end, right? Where that's a full-on liberal Catholic. Like I think Patrick Deneen says, liberal Catholicism within one generation will be liberalism simpliciter. They leave the church. That's what they do.
Right.
But at the 25% spectrum, or closer to the middle, just the average uninformed Catholic that is not even liberal, hasn't been liberalized or progressivized or radicalized, they've just imbibed a lot of this brainwash from the popular culture, the way the assault is constant, day by day, quotidian. They'll say things like, well, what about that? Well, should we really say we like it, or should we just say that it's not evil? So it's a sliding scale continuum, and people have to understand that at the strong end, when you're playing the man, people will literally say, I don't care about this, but that's only the extreme end. Most of the other opponents of the death penalty within the church have to meet muster here and have to at least pay lip service to, what Jesus said matters. Main guy in the New Testament, Son of God himself, says this to Pilate directly. He says, you have this power, and the power he's talking about is the ability to kill me legally, licitly, and morally, only because that power comes from heaven, comes from God. That is as direct a statement as one could hope for.
Right.
Moses says it directly in a number of places. And again, he's kind of the main lawgiver. He's not the Son of God, but he's the main lawgiver in the Old Testament, right? So it doesn't really matter who you're talking to apologetically on that continuum. We have everything we would want. St. Paul, later, we haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, let's do St. Paul. Yeah.
There are a couple passages.
So the really good one is Romans 13. And verse 3, a good conscience has no need to go and fear the magistrate, as a bad conscience does. If thou wouldst be free from the fear of authority, do right, and thou shalt win its approval. The magistrate is God's minister, working for thy good. Only if thou dost wrong, need thou be afraid. It is not for nothing that he bears the sword, for he is God's minister still, to inflict punishment on the wrongdoer. End quote. So here, Paul is saying that the public magistrate, and what's interesting is, you know who the ultimate magistrate is while Paul's writing Romans? According to the dating of Romans, it's Nero.
It's Neronian. And he's still defending it.
Nero is on the throne in Rome, and he's saying, ultimately, the Roman government bears the sword by God's approval, by God's mandate. And ultimately, that sword of Nero is going to go through whose neck? Paul's.
His.
Unjustly. but it's going to happen. Now, there's something really cool here, Tim, that I love to bring up. And that is, in this verse, he says that the public magistrate is God's minister. Guess what the Greek is for minister?
I don't know.
Diakonos, deacon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. That is great.
Paul is literally stating that the public secular magistrate is the deacon of God. Diakonos theou is the Greek. And this is why, by the way, when we get into after Constantine, we actually see public magistrates wearing diaconal vesture.
Right.
And diaconal signs.
Yeah.
There is a connection between all these monarchs wearing the sash like a deacon, over one shoulder, not over both, right? And also the dalmatic, which deacons wear, was originally a public imperial garment.
Really?
Yeah, that was allowed by the Pope wore it after Gregory, and then he allowed only deacons to wear it, the dalmatic. Because it's an imperial thing. So this idea that the deacon is there's a secular deacon, and that's the magistrate, and then there's an ecclesiastical deacon, and he's the one who cares for the public good of the church with the poor and the handling of funds.
Not a lot of gloss is needed to further explicate Romans 13. Should be pretty obvious. Nevertheless, the shamefaced, shameless liberals within the church and within Protestantism have argued, what is the sword here? What is really meant? This,
it's really a Nerf sword. It's a Nerf sword.
It's a Nerf sword.
They just kind of tap you on the head and say, don't do that anymore. Go to jail.
Right.
Yeah.
But even the likes, and this is, he published this long before this was newly debated. Mm-hmm. Even then the likes, I think, of Benedict's papacy, the likes of Dr. Scott Hahn, said very clearly, no, the sword here is equal to the prerogative of civil government. Mm-hmm. He says it clearly and explicitly. Romans 13, you got the Christian Brugers of the world that are out there saying that up is down, even though it's an obvious passage. No, the sword is the ability to kill given by God to civil authority.
I've never heard anyone say the sword means anything else. Do they suggest what it could mean?
I don't remember specifically.
I would just...
It's because it's so counterintuitive.
If I were a liberal, I would just say, well, Paul is just speaking in his ancient Roman context. He doesn't know any better.
He's restraining his finding to the facts before him. Right. It's not what the court says when it doesn't want to be quoted.
But notice that Paul doesn't do that. He's not saying, hey, we need to respect authority so we don't get murdered, we don't get martyred. He's using theological language. The magistrate is God's diakonos. He's God's deacon.
Right. That's right. Deacon in the same sense.
He's appealing to God.
Right.
And God set up this order.
So this has wide sweeping implications. We'll forget what we have to do here today if we get too into it, but there are a couple things. One, he's deacon in the sweeping sense that Susanna and Joanna were, not in the ordained sense, obviously.
And that they are a minister. For the diakonos in Greek, dia means like through, and konos refers to what is common. So a diakonos is in Greek someone who is ministering through the common. Right.
Okay.
So it translates well to like a servant, not like a slave, but like a server,
Like a manservant?
Not a man. Yeah, not really like, it's not in slavery. It's one who like serves them in the master's household. And he does the koino. Like we speak of koine Greek, it's common, just common stuff, He does the common work. That's how he ministers. And obviously a magistrate does that.
Right.
For the common good.
But this is important for tying together the church and the state, because originally, even before Constantine, there's a conception that there shouldn't be this wide divorce between the two. We talk about this in a lot of different realms. There's a parity here, a natural parity, even if you don't have an earthly church that's got all this temporal power that it would get, in between the two Christian millennia. And so that ends up, so that's what they're really talking about with prerogative, right? Like St. Thomas says, again, certain failures of patriotism to support your sovereign nation can be a mortal sin. So when this affects, it's so sweeping, we don't have to talk about it today, but even issues like national sovereignty issues, border walls, things like that, these are in direct support of the authority of the state. And they even count when James Madison talks about the two powers of the state, or the purse and the sword. The sword, it doesn't include just the right of death penalty, the prerogative. It includes the martial power. Right. It includes the power to defend its own borders, its own sovereignty, waging war. All of these things that, I talk about some in my book, like this is all to be affirmed by the Christian. Christians are admonished to, now revolution's possible, under natural law conditions. You got to meet basically the four prongs of a just war. But failing those conditions, the state has this power directly from God, the power of the sword, which includes all this stuff: martial power, lawmaking, sovereign borders binding, and death penalty. So it's important. We have to affirm that unless there's been some natural law violation.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, as you're saying this, I'm thinking to myself, wow, is the Catholic Church joining the leftist attack on the divinely appointed state? Just war is now being questioned. The fact that you would have borders and enforce them is being questioned in Europe and in North America. And the death penalty is now rejected.
Sure.
It seems like in Pope Francis's theology, he's saying, oh, I know you guys were given the sword by God. It goes all the way back to Noah, Old Testament, New Testament, popes, Augustine, Aquinas. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and take that away.
Right.
And what the government is really supposed to do is just redistribute wealth. Thanks. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Which is not what God established the government to do.
No.
It's crazy. It's really crazy.
It is. It's wild. And all this was happening, some trads say this was happening in some of the documents, even, from Vatican II. That's not my point of view. But a lot of people out there are shaking their head as hard as it'll shake. And they're like, well, this is what happened in two of the four sacred constitutions in Vatican II. I don't agree there.
I want to make a commercial here, too, because a lot of people in the comments, they assume that you and I think that Vatican II is the capital THE, the problem. People, that's not what Tim and I have been saying on any of these videos. Tim and I think that the problem goes back way before Vatican II.
100 years before.
We're the paleo. We see paleo problems in our viewpoint. Right. Vatican II is a symptom of a greater problem that began, we would say, in the late 1800s, maybe as far back as 1870. So I just want to make that commercial there because I think some people misunderstand us. That when we say something like that about Vatican II, like, oh, they just think Vatican II flipped the switch. No, we don't think that something got flipped at Vatican II. We think these problems are alluded to by Our Lady of Fatima as early as 1917.
Yeah, and like you said before, in the papacies of Gregory the 16th and Leo the 13th, they're addressing all the innovators that are trying to infiltrate the church. So we take them at their word. These are two of my favorite popes, Gregory the 16th, Leo the 13th. They're the first two popes to distribute under their own coin the Alta Vendita. So that's where we're at.
Yeah.
Now the funny thing is, I think both of you and I make this admission that yes, the spirit of Vatican II, of all people, I think Ross Douthat of the New York Times says this best. I don't usually agree with him, but he characterizes Vatican II uniquely well, and it's basically my characterization of it. It was, as summarily considered, Vatican II, its product, the four sacred constitutions are fine, right? You have to say that. You can't say that a council erred, that would make us into innovators if we uttered that. But it was weaponized ambiguity. I've long held that, even before I heard the nifty term. And Yes, it was, like Dr. Marshall said, a symptom of things that have been going on from about 1870 to 1970. You see you detect all the foul odors, even with, even with some of the language that makes it into the constitutions. But it was written, just take it as a thought experiment. What if those documents and everything that was being considered at Vatican II was written in such a way to allow, including the new Mass, was written in a way that would observe all the norms that need to be observed. But the Jesuits, who loved sociology and psychology, had done all this research, thought experiment, because I think this is what happened. Observed the norms, but they did research where they're writing funky little accidental properties of the Mass and the new speech, the new jargon of the church, in such a way that it would make everyone a practical atheist. Lex orandi, lex credendi, and all that. Then I think that's what happened. And how would you characterize a council if it went like that? And there are 100 years preceding it where you're being infiltrated, and they want to figure out ways to be technically okay, but pastorally, upset things. I think that's what happened. But yeah, technically, yeah, those documents would be fine without the very 100 years preceding them that you're talking about. The language in the documents would be fine if you didn't have the infiltration that had been happening over those 100 years. That's it.
Yeah, and the problem with the documents, with the weaponized ambiguity, is, you can have someone as, crazy, however you want to characterize them, crazy right, like Marcel Lefebvre, who's at Vatican II, and he signs off on some of these documents, but he's
right
reading them in the most conservative way with the hermeneutic continuity. You have Benedict XVI doing something he's not as strict as someone like Lefebvre, but he's trying in his pontificate to promote that. But then you can also have a pontificate like Pope Francis, where that continuity is not honored.
Right.
So what we have is ambiguity. And that ambiguity, Tim and I have been saying this whole time, was cooked into it. There's purposeful ambiguity in these documents.
Cooked into it with affirmative knowledge that now they've hit the tipping point where a majority of the receivers of the language they just created will be friendly to their apparatchik point of view.
That's right.
The new Jacobins in the church.
Yep.
So yeah, there's another, back to St. Paul. People talk about Acts chapter 25 verse 11 less, but this is, I think, is kind of like some of the other scriptural passages you're talking about, Dr. Marshall. This is as good as you could want from, infallible scriptures. St. Paul says, he's making this appeal to Rome. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by the Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he's appealing to Caesar, saying the death penalty is explicitly good, generally. But it's not good because I'm innocent. He's not saying that the death penalty is bad. You couldn't really want a better defense of the death penalty than what he says here.
What's remarkable, this actually, people always say, the Paul in Acts is not the Paul in the epistle, which is baloney. But here we see Paul's making the same argument he made in Romans 13. And it's think about this for a moment, people. Here is a Jewish rabbi, Saul, who becomes Paul. And the Jews saw the Romans as invaders and bringing Gentile law over their nation, and they knew they were the chosen people, and they knew they had sovereignty and autonomy by God's mandate. And yet here is a learned Jewish rabbi, Paul, saying that Rome has divine right over him, a Jew.
Right.
That's explosive theology. I mean, I wrote a trilogy, Crucified Rabbi, Catholic Perspective on Paul, and Eternal City, which is on Rome. And those second two books, Catholic Perspective on Paul, and then the third part, the Eternal City, talks about this shift that we see in Acts, we see it in Peter, we see it in Paul, where they begin to see that the prophecy in Daniel, where the Son of Man receives the Gentile secular kingdoms from the Ancient of Days, that this is the transfer of the Roman Empire, of all secular empires, to the Messiah, to the Son of Man. So now Yahweh is no longer he's just the King of Israel, King of the Jews. Christ is now King of the Romans, King of the Persians, King of the Greeks. And that Peter and Paul go to Rome because they realize that Christ has received the Roman Empire. And they take over the Roman Empire. I always use the analogy of, in Star Wars, when it's the first episode 4, but the original one, 1977.
Yep.
So Luke Skywalker, he's going into the Death Star, right? And they're in those little, what do you call them, alleys, and they're like flying around. And Darth Vader's behind them in the TIE fighter, right? And they're going along, and then he hears Obi-Wan say, use the Force. Is that what he says?
Yeah.
Use the Force.
The Force, Luke.
And he closed his eyes there. Man, I'm spacing out here.
Yeah, he tells him to turn off the computer.
Yes.
It's a little, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he goes, and then he fires, doosh, doosh, and 2 torpedoes come out of the X-Wing and go down the hole in the shaft. And then he pulls out, and then the whole thing just blows up, right? It's awesome. I always say that is Peter and Paul, those 2 torpedoes entering into the heart of Rome, right? And when they impact, when they implode with their death, with their blood, right? That right there just blows up the Roman Empire. At that moment,
Peter and Paul being shot into the Mamertine prison.
Yes, exactly.
The heart.
Yes, exactly. In the Mamertine prison.
Deep.
It's getting deep.
Yeah.
Those 2 apostles, the apostle of the circumcised and the uncircumcised, the Jews and the Gentiles, they are embedded into Rome, literally. And it's their blood, it's their teaching, it's their martyrdom that triggers the conversion of the Roman Empire and fulfills the book of Daniel, that the Son of God, Jesus Christ, has received the Roman kingdom. That's why we're called Roman Catholic, and why he was crucified on a Roman cross. Why we do this. It's Roman, Latin, all that stuff. So anyway, if you want to learn more.
Some people think that, and I always argue what you're arguing. I mean, without the book of Daniel, but Roman Catholic is not just the Roman rite.
That's right.
Roman Catholic is all the rites of the church, even people that go to Greek rite, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there's going to be someone, this always happens, who's a Byzantine Catholic, and I love the Byzantine Catholics. Hats off to all of you.
Yeah.
But they'll say, well, I'm not a Roman Catholic, I'm a Byzantine Catholic, I'm a Ukrainian Catholic, or whatever. Okay, look, if you go back and read the documents of the Eastern Orthodox Church, or even pre-schism, they are constantly referring to themselves as the Roman Church, as the Romans in Constantinople.
Right.
They see themselves as Roman. In fact, even the Nestorian Christians who broke off in schism, way before our schism in the 1000s, in China, they were referred to as the Romans because they saw Christianity as Roman. Even the Muslims, the Turks, would refer to the Greeks as the Romans. So Christianity is Roman. It's true that you have your own rite and it's not the Roman rite. But Jesus died on a Roman cross under Pontius Pilate. The mystery of salvation and soteriology happened for you in the Roman context, under the Romans.
300 years before the capital of Rome was shifted from Rome to Constantinople and all that.
Even the Eastern Orthodox grant, pre-schism, that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is prime. Why? Because he is the Bishop of Rome.
Don't they? But total.
It's not political; it's theological.
Right. They say he's first among equals now, right? And he doesn't have jurisdiction over them, but he's still first in charge of the most important see, right?
Originally, they would say he did have jurisdiction because you have Maximus the Confessor appealing to Rome for theology. He's an Eastern. People recognized it. You have Athanasius appealing to Rome. You have John of Chrysostom appealing to Rome. You have all these great Eastern fathers that appeal to Rome. So, their Eastern Orthodox apologetics hadn't reached them yet that they didn't have to appeal to Rome, which is not true. Yeah. This is why I'm not Eastern Orthodox. Kind of wish I could be, but I can't be.
Just for their liturgy. Yeah.
Yeah, their liturgy, the piety, all that's wonderful. Can I share a quote from Augustine?
Do it.
Move back west. So Augustine, he wrote this magnum opus called The City of God. And in The City of God, he basically just goes through salvation history. He talks about the two cities, the city of man, the city of God, and how they're in competition with one another. The city of God, which is Christ's city, will win. But he says this: the same divine authority that forbids the killing of a human being establishes certain exceptions, as when God authorizes killing by a general law, or when he gives an explicit commission to an individual for a limited time. So he's saying God has exceptions to thou shalt not kill. Then he says, the agent who executes the killing does not commit homicide. He is an instrument, as is the sword with which he cuts. I like that.
I have them. Yeah.
Therefore, it is in no way contrary to the commandment, thou shalt not kill, to wage war at God's bidding, for the representatives of public authority to put criminals to death according to the law, that is, the will of most just reason, end quote. So Augustine is just saying what all Christians believed in the 400s, commonly accepted.
Right. And it's this agency theory is also why, however quasi-justifiable vigilantism would be if someone killed your entire family, totally justifiable to want to go and maybe even to go and seek them out and kill them in revenge.
Right.
It's only quasi-justifiable because you are acting under your own agency. Even though it's a totally justifiable impulse to want revenge. And again, if you go do it, just go seek confession or whatever. But well, I mean,
but it would be wrong. We're saying
it's wrong. It would violate the fifth commandment because you're acting not as an instrumentality of the state, which is what prerogative is.
Correct.
It's this power passed by God to the state. And any agents of the state are not acting under their own agency.
Right. They're
it's
acting
a very important
in the name of the law, in the name of the state. Just like, you know, Thomas Aquinas says just laws have to be promulgated by proper authority for one who has care of the community. So I can't issue laws and I can't
interdict. We
I
can't do interdicts.
I have to go and get elected and then I can help issue laws. Same thing, you know, I can't go and shoot a guy robbing a store. I mean, I guess if it's in Texas, we have the right to carry, and we can intervene in extreme cases. But I can't go and do an investigation as a private investigator and then go and shoot somebody.
No. But this is the heart of the issue. So you just said what can you do as a private agent on behalf of the state? There are two. Remember those two competing motives, justifications for death penalty. There's the principle of retribution itself, number one. Right, the principle of punishment. The prime principle of it is retribution. This means you're punishing some past action that belongs solely to the state. The lesser justification, number two, is protection of self or others. Is the legal term, the protection of innocence. Now, two, because it's futurative, right? It's also a secondary reason that we have the death penalty, though it's always partly speculative because you don't know how many lives you're saving by killing this murderer. That's another reason why it's less. But also, it belongs in imminent cases it's a power that does belong to individuals. It is not the prerogative. The prerogative of the state is just justification number one, punishing past crimes on behalf of the principle of retribution itself.
Right.
But two, if someone breaks into your house, you are not trying to assume the mantle of state prerogative. You're not making yourself larger than you are when you take a gun and you blow a guy away, right? That's what I'll do to you if you break into my house.
Right.
That's not me assuming the mantle of the government, because that is a direct, clear and present danger to me or other innocents, my wife, my kids, in my household. Right. That has nothing to do with, well, aren't you acting as your own agent? You're not just an instrumentality of the state. No, I'm not there. I don't need it because that's not prerogative. That's just defense of innocents or others.
You're not running a trial and doing something of the state. You're solely protecting lives at that moment.
Right. Which is yet one more reason, add it to the list, why it's absurd to talk about the only justification for the death penalty as protection, that reason number two. It's not actually prerogative. Prerogative is the main reason, and that's the thing we never hold.
Yeah. And by the way, when we do that, if someone comes into your house and you wake up and you've got one of your kids at knife point and you shoot them, you are not undermining the dignity of that criminal.
Not
as we would read in Pope Francis's 2267. That's what's just crazy. That's why I can't get my head around is how the Pope could say that this is an attack on the dignity of the human person. That if the state justly kills a person, it's an attack. It's just contrary to everything in the Jewish and Christian tradition.
Well, only a fool uses a term that he hasn't first defined. Well, I mean, I just used a bunch of words in that sentence that I didn't first define, but uses a question term that's not yet defined. Dignity. Dignity. What is the word?
Well, I think we know what that means. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely being disputed when they start saying that it has something to do with life and death that's not related to inalienable rights. Dignity is always related to the concept of unalienability of our rights. Like, I cannot rob someone of their right to life. And that means an innocent party. The way the church has always defined the right to life, though, since it's one of the authors of these three natural rights that are loom so large on the American landscape, you can rob yourself of the right to life. And that's what a murderer has done. And therefore, we're not taking away something inalienable. When a robber comes and puts a gun to your head and says, your money or your life, what is he doing? This is what my contracts professor always said. That's Sophie's choice. He's making you pick between two things that you shouldn't have to pick between. You have a right to both, your money and your life, your property and your life.
Yep.
So that's wrong. That's a natural breach of your natural rights. But except when the state takes the life of someone who's already forfeit their life, like Faramir says in The Two Towers, he's like, my life is forfeit then if I've violated if I've done a capital offense against the state. I'm doing it. You're not doing it. So alienability is only a concept that can be executed in the case of an inalienable right by you yourself, by screwing up. By me, myself, by screwing up.
Amen to that. Yeah. Can I share some Aquinas?
Do it.
All right. So this is Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3. Thomas Aquinas says, the fact that the evil ones, as long as they live, can be corrected from their errors does not prohibit that they may be justly executed. For the danger which threatens from their way of life is greater and more certain than the good which may be expected from their improvement. So here he's directly addressing the idea of it's not just to protect the innocent, right?
Right.
They also have, at that critical point of death, the opportunity to be converted to God through repentance. And if they are so obstinate that even at the point of death, their heart does not draw back from malice, it is possible to make a quite probable judgment that they would never come away from evil, end quote. So here we see Thomas Aquinas talking about how it's not just to protect the innocent, and there is the remedial element of capital punishment, which is to foment, to foster a conversion in the heart.
Imagine what a great grace this is when you think about it. When you have a saint like St. Augustine making a long conversion with under the mantle, Lord, make me holy, but not yet, right? St. Augustine would have pushed his conversion more than 2 decades off. He would have pushed it to his very deathbed if he knew the hour of his death. A saint and many of us fall into this category as well. The knowing of the minute and the hour of your death is such a great grace that is reserved under this auspice. It's almost like dignity plus. It's not dignity minus, right? Convicted murderers on death row have this luxury that none of us have. They know the exact hour, so they can, they can be gluttons and whatever else. They can commit all the extra sins until that last hour. I mean, I'm not admonishing this, but they have a great grace. They have, like St. Thomas says, this passage from Summa Contra Gentiles, they have the luxury that none of us have. They can literally just do a deathbed confession. The problem with deathbed confession,
every obstinate sinner says, whether they're a teenager or a 45-year-old man, well, I'll just get back to church one day, or I'll eventually go to confession.
Right.
That's roulette, man.
It is.
You don't know that. Right. And honestly, if we're honest, same with the guy, okay, he says you're going to be killed on, March 30th of next year. Okay, that's his death date, but he can still have a heart attack tomorrow.
No, that's true.
Or
That's
another prison mate might beat his head in,
right,
with a lead pipe or something. So we don't know the day or the hour, but there is a pressure placed upon the criminal when you definitely have a death date.
Right.
Just imagine, just imagine. And all of us, we've all experienced this in college or high school where you have a paper that's due.
Right.
And you procrastinate, which is procrast, like for the next day. You just push it forward. But when it's the next day, you have to get on the computer and make that paper. If the teacher said, I gave you all a week extension, I got 2 or 3 days off.
Right.
And then you go back at it, right? So the due date, the end date, does inspire proper action. And Thomas Aquinas is saying that in the ultimate test, which is the test of the heart. Do you repent and receive Jesus Christ into your heart and receive the remission of sins? That's the ultimate
great
test.
Analogy.
It's the ultimate test that we all have. These men, because of their grave sin, get a due date for their paper.
Right. Which I'd love to have.
I'll give you one. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, you know what, Tim? I read this was actually before. No, I was a Catholic. Maybe I wasn't. I may have been an Anglican. I can't remember. I read a spiritual work. I can't remember who wrote it exactly, but he said a really good meditation on death is to take a date a month from now and say, that is my death date. And then live the next 30 days as if that is the day you are going to die. Literally. And he says you're going to have to get your papers in order, organize your desk, get your will in order, go to confession all the time, pray the rosary every day, read scripture, get deeper with the Lord, all these things. And then the night before that night, you say your last prayer to God. And you make an act of contrition. And he says the next morning when you wake up, you are a resurrected man. You have become at least a saint for that day because you've prepared yourself. You've been mindful of death. You've created a fake death date and you ordered your whole life to that date and it made you a saint, at least for that day. And I think I like that. I did that once and it was awesome. I woke up the next day and I was like, wow, my life is in order. My soul, my work, my business, my affairs. You write the letter that you needed to write to the old friend, or you say sorry to the person that you've always needed to say sorry to. It's I can't remember who wrote that, but it's a good...
Is that Alphonsus Liguori?
I don't think it was. But it's a good...
What I like about it is that it forces the opponents of the death penalty to really come out proud, as they say about the gays, as opponents of human nature writ large, because this is human nature. This is everything you're talking about. Great analogy with papers. I was searching for one too. That's a great analogy. A paper. If you ever had a professor that pushed back the due date of a paper 2 or 3 times, you procrastinate. If it pushes back, then I'm not starting it.
Yeah.
But you'll eventually do it unless you're just a total flunky.
Right.
Which St. Thomas says there are some total flunkies in humanity where they failed the ultimate test of the heart. They will not repent even in the last moment, even though they have a luxury none of us have, a dead date. There are some guys that'll just go to the bathroom and do drugs instead of doing their paper eventually. Right. That's not most of us. Most of us will procrastinate until there's a foreseeable thing. So the opponents of the death penalty are opponents of human nature, and that's what progressivism is. It's a hatred of nature and of human nature. And an utter attempt, it's a shrill shriek, lifting the fist to heaven to say, I don't want nature to be this way. I don't want men and women to be this way. I want there to be 70 sexes or genders. I don't want man to have been hardwired in a moral way. I don't want the principle of, retributivism and proportionalism to govern our moral acts. I don't want to be punished for my transgressions. It's all of that rolled into one.
Yeah.
And they openly own this when it comes to the death penalty. That's why it's such a great issue. That's why it's a natural follow-up after Amoris Laetitia, is this amendment of the death penalty. So look what it does. You're getting rid of calling crimes, certain crimes in Amoris Laetitia. Now you're getting rid of the penalty for those crimes. It's an utter rewiring of sin writ large. I think you couldn't write it this strange.
So that sparks two questions I have for you, Tim, and for everybody watching. The first is, how does this relate to Marxism in a politically atheist worldview? And then the second is, does Pope Francis changing this in the midst of the McCarrick, Vigano, sexual abuse crisis, is there a connection there? Some people have said, isn't it convenient that the death penalty has been scrubbed right when we have the conviction of these horrific prelates who are raping children? Oh, and by the way, there is no death penalty. So maybe we can speak to the first one, too. How does this relate to Marxism?
Well, the funny thing, I was talking about this the other day, 2 days ago. Marxism, if you listen to who I listened to a lot in college and grad school, the secular conservatives, I mean smart ones, smart secular conservatives, there's who usually embrace the Enlightenment, by the way, because what they're doing really with the secular conservative project is essentially to accept everything from the Enlightenment, except for post-Enlightenment, economic turnaround, where then all of a sudden they started justifying, the postmoderns after the Enlightenment started justifying the large state, redistributive state. That's the only thing secular conservatives by and large want to do. Go listen to Ben Shapiro or Jonah Goldberg. They say the Enlightenment's great. It's given us all these, it's given us capitalism. Wrong. Capitalism was around far before that. It's given us all the advances of medicine and technology and science. That's not right. And they define Marxism as just the what they want to do. Marxism is really the ultimate project of the Enlightenment. Yeah. And it's post-Enlightenment, and it has some of these romantic capital R aspersions that it casts against the Enlightenment wall. But really, it is the bringing God down from the throne and the enthronement of man. You look at where the altar is, and you basically just want to see a mirror. It's the enthronement of man. Right. And the ultimate in the moral theology, the sort of high point of enthroning oneself would be that you can get away with anything. It's Ivan Karamazov, right? When he's like, if there is no God, then anything is permitted. I can do whatever I want. Yeah. So do you remember the ring in Plato's Republic, the original order? The ring. Yeah. So he talks about the ring, and there's this guy. If you wear the ring, you can commit any crime, and you won't be caught. I don't remember that. That's not book 6 or 7. Maybe it's not in the Republic. No, I'm pretty sure it's in the Republic. No, go ahead. Anyway, I only know. So he says that Plato observes. He's like, if this ring existed, men would wear it, and then they would just go rape their neighbor's pretty wife, and they would steal funds, and they would just do whatever they wanted to do because there would be no check on their desires, on their lusts. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the original Bilbo, Frodo, Gollum situation that you can cloak. You would be able to cloak your vice, and it seems to me that in Marxism, it's atheism to its practical end. Even Augustine in City of God said, if there is no God, the greatest good is the distribution of material goods. Augustine said that in 400s, right? So we see that if there is no heaven, there's no soul, there's no final cause, there's no beatific vision. All there is food and oil
and land and homes, then let's just make sure that everybody kind of gets an equal piece of the pie before we all die and rot and become the food of worms. I mean, that's the Marxist point.
It is. And to do, and well, yeah, that's a good, those are a couple really great polls by you, good quote polls by you. But I mean, also, I think the real Marxists, the real guys behind the guys, Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and eventually Stalin, they knew that this doesn't work out because it's so counternatural, the redistribution. So I think they're kind of pulling strings so that ultimately there's this great quote. I've alluded to it several times in these videos. Marx talking about what his ultimate aim is. And it's the aim of Lucifer, he says. And for whatever reason, they pull it and they put it on the screen in the EWTN documentary, Wolf in Sheep's Clothes, about Saul Alinsky. So go watch that movie anyway. It's amazing. And it's got a bunch of great quotes you don't find elsewhere. I can't find it because I don't have any keywords from the quote I remember aside from Lucifer and Marx. Right. And if you Google that, you don't get anything. But he says, my ultimate goal is the goal of Lucifer, the dethronement of God. And so, yeah, so there is that aspect you're talking about. The highest good, if there is no metaphysics, no God, no afterlife, is just, I guess the equalization of material pleasure. But why even equalize it then? I think the really smart Marxists, the shrewd Marxists, I should say, would say it's really just it's doing whatever I want. Forget the concept of equalness. That's an abstract concept that I guess doesn't exist on their atheist worldview. So there's something to ultimately the concept that for Marxism, liberty is nothing more than license, doing whatever you want for whatever's sake, right? And getting away with it and remaining unpunished. So to me, this is sort of like the bottom, this is like the denominator. What you can do what you want. Remember, like you quoted Dead Poets Society, food for worms, Robin Williams. But the ultimate line in that movie is like, you can do what you want as long as you're willing to suffer the consequences. This is the ultimate, I think, sort of denominator of Marxism that doesn't get talked about a lot. It's right. Do what you want and don't get punished for it. And that's why abolishing that, now to factor in your second question, that's why in Francis Church 2018, we're late in the game, as Soreman says, this late in the game, probably this late in the history of the world. Yeah, I intuit we're somewhere toward the end, if no one knows. Doing away with the ultimate punishment in a relativistic world is the next natural play. Like I said, you do away with calling a sin, but just in case heaven still views it as a sin, you at least get rid of the material punishment. Right.
And Freud says, all the materialists say, all of our actions are just little bubblings of matter in our brain, in our neural column. So we're not really responsible for anything we do. There's no formal cause in the human. There's no soul. So, why punish anyone?
Right.
The reason that man killed a bunch of women and ate their flesh and buried them in this basement was just, because he was a troubled youth.
Or his endocrinology was slightly off. Right, it was slightly different from the norm.
Which is true. I think we all agree with that. But there is something moral embedded in this, and we need to get back to that. Everyone can't get a free pass.
Right.
There are people who have had horrific childhoods who are great saints. And again, we have to be careful with all this stuff, but we cannot just excuse grave evil and just say insanity. Well, yeah, anyone who would do those things is insane. But historically, we've also seen them as moral agents.
Right.
As you were talking there, Tim, I was reminded of there's this alleged interview that Pope Francis had with Scalfari, the journalist.
Eugenio.
Yes. Yeah. And it was a private meeting on the occasion of Easter.
I remember this.
And Scalfari said that the Pope says that hell does not exist. You remember this?
I do.
Now, of course, there's no video recording of this and no verbatim words, but Scalfari says, quote, Pope Francis told him, Hell doesn't exist. The disappearance of the souls of sinners exists. So, if Francis believes this, and I put it if, because I don't have direct text from, this is Scalfari saying Pope Francis said. The Pope is saying there is no hell. Instead, there's the disappearance of the souls of sinners. This is what's called in theology annihilationism. It's the belief that the souls of the damned are annihilated. Now, there's some philosophical problems with that because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and our souls are good. So for God to annihilate them is actually a crime against ontology. We won't get into that. But what's interesting to me is if Pope Francis really said this and really believes it, he is admitting that God applies the death penalty to souls. That God just snuffs them out.
That's interesting.
You see what I'm saying? You see the connection I'm making here? That there's no eternal punishment. There's no eternal prison. There's no life imprisonment in secula seculorum. Instead, God just goes, you're gone. So in a certain sense, if Francis is saying this, capital punishment is the eschatological, ontological end of the unrepentant sinner. Which doesn't fit with Christian soteriology or ontology or metaphysics or anything. But it's kind of ironic to me that the Pope says, hey, we can't end the lives of people on earth because it's contrary to human dignity. But in the eschaton, God ends the existence of their soul for eternity. What?
That's interesting. That's an interesting take on that, because I always thought, for one thing, I'm confident he did say that.
You think he told Scalfari?
Yeah,
we don't know. Why. Okay, yeah, tell me why.
For one thing, so this is the third interview he'd granted to Scalfari, and in each of the prior two, Scalfari just does interviews by notes. It's like the way I did the first Ditka interview. I was like, "Sorry to Eugenio Scalfari you," and he was like, "What?" He was like, "Wait, well, that's not a gay thing, is it?" And he does notes and he reconstructs the interview later. And by
the way, journalists out there, not a good mode.
Not a good.
Not a good.
Wait, unless you're an apparatchik or friendly to apparatchiks, and you want to use weaponized ambiguity. So after two,
so later on you can reconstruct it.
Right. But I mean, even from Francis's point of view, they say this is why he does it with Scalfari.
Right.
Because he had, this is 3 big interviews now. The third one's the one Dr. Marshall's referring to, where he said, people just, evanesce or whatever. Something big in one and two. I won't go into what each of them are. And in none of the 3 cases did the Vatican deny it.
No.
So you just have Scalfari say it. The Vatican didn't deny any of them. This is why I don't have one. You don't have one, but we don't have mouthpieces that can retract what we said. Oh, Tim didn't mean that. Taylor didn't mean this.
Right. We're on camera.
Well, we're on camera, and if I said something stupid, I have to go and either defend it or deny it. And it's I think. I mean, I actually will have to take your point of view and go noodle with it, because I think it's interesting. It is more equivalent to the death penalty than I was giving consideration before. But I think it goes hand in hand. The denial of hell gets notched one up, it gets scaled one up the punishment afterlife. Mm-hmm. And I would say this is sort of consistent with the concept of Pope Francis wants to do away with bodily death. Now he's willing to one notch down in the eschaton, I guess, deal the equivalent of soul death just by vanishing the soul. But except that still, I think most sinners would think is preferable to the eternal torments of hell. Just ask Judas Iscariot, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it goes along with Francis's whole project, which whether or not he knows it, I'll throw that out there this late in the game, is Marxist, right? Is doing precisely what I said earlier, doing away with the natural consequences of sin, and even redefining sin, as we see in Mors Laetitia, and then attempting to reconfigure the entire church structure in moral theology so that there is no eternal punishment for the damned.
Yeah. And there's also the line in Amoris Laetitia where it says, I think it's punishment is contrary to the gospel. I'm trying to Google it right now, but I can't find it. Are you aware of that one? I'm trying to remember what's the citation in Amoris for that.
It's right. Shoot, that's right at the beginning of chapter 8. I don't have it.
I thought so.
It's eternal punishment.
Yes.
Is contrary to the nature of the gospel. Yeah. I used to know all of these citations by heart, but yeah, eternal punishment or everlasting punishment is contrary to the nature of the gospel.
Yeah, here it is. They cannot be condemned forever because that is not the logic of the gospel.
Wow.
Is that it?
That's it. They cannot be condemned forever.
That's it. No one can be condemned forever because that is not the logic of the gospel. Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia. People have all been like on the footnote. They've been going crazy on the footnote. But for me, that right there is the most bold statement in all of Amoris because it's denying hell. And so if,
Me too.
That kind of does suggest, like you said, Tim, that the ad hoc interview where Francis says that hell doesn't exist, that would be an explicit clarification of what he already indicated in Amoris Laetitia. Again, people listen to this. Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia. No one can be condemned forever because that is not the logic of the gospel.
That is the gospel. It is revolutionary.
Well, the gospel is we will be condemned forever, but God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever should believe in him should have everlasting life. That is the gospel. And if there's no hell for Jesus, why did Jesus die on the cross? Why did he go through the scourging at the pillar and the crowning of thorns and carrying the cross and spat upon and punched and nailed to the wood and the descent into hell? And why did all of this happen? So we can do social projects and that's about it? No, there is a deep metaphysical, eschatological, soteriological solution to our greatest problem, and that is death and eternal punishment.
Yeah.
That's
Michael
Christianity.
Morris does a great thing where he says if there's no hell, he goes through it all in like the course of 7 minutes in a Vortex episode. There's no hell, it undoes everything. It undoes the whole Christian project. Yeah. Hell's central. And so is punishment. So it's the concept of death, of the body and of the soul, that makes the need for an expiator go, and makes the concept of expiation go, and makes the concept of sin go, and without it, the whole project unwinds.
There's no blood atonement, everything, sacrifice. Why are we eating the body, blood, soul, divinity of Jesus at Mass? I mean,
right.